Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and this week we are returning to the critical issues surrounding the financing of infrastructure, and specifically how private investment can be levered in to support the global ambition for a green energy transition. I mean, it's clear that the global push towards net zero is fundamentally a challenge of capital mobilisation. While the global institutional investors sit on an estimated 100 trillion in assets, less than 5% of this wealth actually flows into sustainable or green development. This must change, of course, if governments around the world are to meet their ambitions for a green energy transition. And my guest today is Georgie Skipper, the founder of infrastructure investment consultancy Lucetia Group, someone who has worked on one of the most ambitious clean energy projects ever attempted and who has spent the last few decades wrestling with the accelerating global green energy challenge. Because energy transition is a huge global challenge, according to a recent report by the Australian government, the emerging Southeast Asian region alone faces an estimated 3 trillion investment infrastructure gap by 2040 in meeting its vital clean energy targets that of course are crucial to the economy and to its decarbonisation. And this kind of investment gap is a global issue, one that Georgie will be highlighting at the ongoing Financing and Energy Transition in Southeast Asia series hosted by Lucetia and Bentley Systems in partnership with the Investor Group on climate change. The most recent of these meetings was held at last year's COP30 meeting in Belém in Brazil, and they're being rolled out at the London Climate Action Week, which is taking place right now. So let's hear more about the market, the challenges, and how we can smooth and de-risk the global sustainable and green energy investment challenge. Georgie, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony. It's lovely to be here.
Well, Georgie, let's start by unpacking the challenge and the opportunities of financing global renewable energy projects. As I say, the capital for energy transition exists. The question is how to mobilise it. So set the scene for us. What is the fundamental disconnect between the trillions sitting in pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance balance sheets, and the renewable green project reality? What's broken?
Well, it's a big, complex question. I suppose the first part is, are there enough projects to invest in? You know, this is about creating the enabling environment. The enabling environment is a really critical factor. So what does that mean? That means we need policy and regulation to actually help ensure that projects can be built, that there's certainty for investors, and investor confidence is really critical to actually say, yes, these projects are bankable. So enabling environment is really big. The second factor, I think, is risk and tolerance for risk, and also whether there's actually an adjusted element to risk. Like what's real risk and what's perceived risk, and how do we actually bridge the gap between those things?
Right, yeah.
So I think enabling environment and risk are really critical.
Well, a lot of people frame the energy transition as a climate problem, but you've actually argued that it's an economic security and an industrial strategy problem. What do you mean by that then? You know, why does this distinction matter?
Suddenly, all things are happening at once. We need to, we have net zero targets that are really ambitious. Governments and companies need to meet those. And then on the other side of the equation, now we're also seeing that we can't actually build the projects and the infrastructure we set out to do to meet these targets because of critical minerals, demand on those, sort of prices and all these things happening at once. We can't finance all of these areas. So industrial strategy is kind of key to how any government actually looks at this issue.
Yeah.
And it's all about the economics. But I think there's another element to the problem as well. I don't think it's technology. I think it's actually about people.
Right.
And I think it's about how we work together.
That cultural issue once again. But yeah, that said, a 2025 report by the World Meteorological Organization confirmed the world is on track to breach its 1.5 degrees C warming goals, putting immense pressure on carbon-heavy infrastructure. I mean, how does that looming climate reality, change the risk management equation for global asset managers?
Well, suddenly green energy generation is now actually the cheapest form of meeting those targets. So what this means is it's actually set the direction for investors and the finance community, and it makes sense to invest in these projects. Right. And it makes sense to actually finance the energy transition. So in many respects, this is a really good news story.
Yeah, so it's a really fundamental driver.
Exactly.
But it's not the only reason for doing it, is what you're saying.
That's right. And it actually has to come down to the economics. Does this make sense to invest in? And so, a few years ago, that wasn't even certain. But now that shift has happened. And so there's a really, really good news story in all of that. I think the complexity, though, is actually being able to keep up with the pace of the speed at which that needs to happen.
Yeah, just simply because the demand for power is increasing globally.
And AI has become a big part of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we see that in the US where they realize, that they have to have every form of energy source.
Yes.
Just doing petrochemicals alone is just not enough. But of course, as well as the need to tackle climate change, we've got massive biodiversity issues. This is an issue which is fundamental to safeguarding quite a lot of the natural environment.
Very much so. And I think actually what's really interesting is almost like the new frontier of the energy transition is nature-based solutions and considering nature as a system. How do you actually price and value keeping nature and leveraging what we have and what we have access to, but ensuring that it's not just sustainable, but it's regenerative. Like we're actually considering how to build out our planet in a really sustainable way and in perpetuity. And I think this is the kind of next.
Yeah, this is how do we make sure that through this energy transition we're making the world fundamentally a better place for humans to live.
Yes, and we're building the infrastructure that actually supports not just the thing we need to deliver now, i.e. power, but how do we make sure that power and that system is built in a really sustainable way. That goes back to how you actually build it, how it supports the community, what it enables the community to get access to, consider the different parts of the system.
Let's talk a bit about you and Lucetia Group and its role in this whole deal-making process. You came into the energy business from quite an unusual angle, not as an engineer or a financier, but from foreign policy and geostrategy. You served as a senior advisor to Australia's foreign minister. How did that vantage point really shape how you see the energy transition, perhaps differently from most people?
I think coming from Australia, we have had a really complex relationship with climate change. We've, arguably lost several prime ministers because of this issue of climate change. And so that really stuck with me when I was working in government. And to me, I saw this issue as kind of a systems problem. Australia is blessed with a lot of natural resources. We could really kind of work the transition to our advantage if we wanted to, and we're starting to do that. But I became very interested in looking at that issue and saying, well, what can we actually do on a global platform? What can Australia do, and what does the world need to do to actually kind of work more closely on this issue?
I had this conversation with a guest recently around the fact that Australia climate change is in your face, and so therefore it makes it a real key issue for you.
Exactly.
That's how you see it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting drive. I mean, in your career, you have been involved in a number of so-called first-of-a-kind technologies, and we'll delve into those a bit later on. But clean energy projects are inherently more complex, perhaps, than many infrastructure projects. What kind of novel public-private financing vehicles are you seeing working to reduce that risk and manage that risk better?
Well, because the complexity of building energy projects requires so much. It requires offtake. Who's going to buy the power? It requires the actual financial model for the project to work on its merits. But at the moment, there is a disconnect between that for many projects. And the role of government is a really big factor in this. And I think the things that are working is where governments can identify where they can de-risk through various different financial mechanisms and actually take away that kind of first edge so that it crowds in private sector investment.
Yeah, it is coming up with more blended financing options. Essentially, we have a range of government grants, private sector investment, maybe some other sources of funding, etc.
Exactly. And getting really creative with how to do that. But also, I think the other thing is, governments actually need to back the mandate of taking on the risk. And what I've seen in different settings is that there'll be a government policy to actually finance risky projects and then not do that.
Yeah.
And so we need to actually, that's really, really key, like sticking to that mandate and, seeing first of a kind projects, backing risky, ambitious things actually forces the market to see those opportunities.
Yeah, and gives them the confidence to actually see them through as well. You created the business, Lucetia Group, after a 20-year career working with the public sector and the Australian government and in the private sector. What prompted you to set out on your own then?
I think what I'd seen, I was very fortunate to work with highly ambitious people, so Mike Cannon-Brookes and Andrew Forrest, who backed building the world's largest renewable energy infrastructure in the world.
This is the Sun Cable project. Yeah.
Exactly,
We'll talk about a bit about that in a moment.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in working for highly ambitious people and seeing that, I think the key thing in what I saw was being able to actually break down the silos, breaking down a silo between the commerciality of the project, how you're going to build it, the engineering of it, the geopolitical landscape. And so I wanted to put something together where we could pull together expertise from every different kind of area and bring that together and work and do that authentically.
Yeah. And you say that the group positions itself as a strategic bridge between innovation, capital, and governments. And you talk about systems level thinking. So what does that mean in practice when Lucetia is advising a government or investor?
It means that we try and look at the entire system from a boundary set. So we might say, how do you actually scale infrastructure investment in the Philippines? And look at that and look at the policy dynamics and the policy issues that need to match the investor interest and also need to match what governments are seeking too.
Right.
So we kind of take that boundary set and we analyze that. And then we work out a roadmap for actually how to change the system and find the lever that actually has the network effect that will have the biggest change.
Yeah, so you're looking at what the outcomes from that investment are beyond perhaps just creating that energy source. It's actually what are you trying to achieve for that nation.
Exactly.
Yeah. In April 2026, you were appointed by the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Energy Market Authority to develop the ASEAN submarine power cable guidelines. How will this specific framework actively unlock private investment and change the game for future projects?
Yes, I'm really thrilled that that this work is being undertaken. Basically, the ASEAN Power Grid has half of its projects as submarine power cables.
Right, yeah.
And there is currently no regulation or framework to support how to actually build these projects and set the regulatory landscape. And so we're delighted to be working on this because we see that this is really a pathfinder for the way that governments can cooperate and at a multilateral level as well as a bilateral, trilateral level, and also gives investors the confidence to look at these financing these projects.
But it also goes back to the systems approach, I suppose, and that having those cable interconnectors is absolutely vital.
Exactly. You need, vast amounts of power to be able to be distributed across different nations and truly get an interconnected grid. I mean, Europe's brilliant at this. Like the synchronous grid has 24 countries and connects and it does that and it enables actually energy security. And that's exactly what the ASEAN region is seeking.
It's interesting you say we're brilliant. I think many would say we have to get better. Because you also chair the Green Grids Initiative, and you just released a report on the Asia Pacific electrical transmission supply chain, which highlighted, and I quote, clean energy transition faces a critical transmission supply chain bottleneck driven by a systemic coordination failure across the ecosystem. So what is that failure then? How do you describe that failure?
Well, Lucetia Group is a very proud consortium member of the Green Grids Initiative, which was obviously founded by the UK and Indian governments at COP26 to set a really clear pathway to accelerate the development of grids and transmission and interconnectors. And one of the fundamental biggest issues in building out grids, transmission and interconnectors globally is access to the supply chain. So access to high voltage direct current cables, as well as also other parts of the supply chain like voltage source converters, and even actually the vessels that lay those cables or repair those cables. So there is a really big mismatch at the moment between being able to access those key elements of the supply chain and then the ambition of the projects that need to be built. Yeah,
because if you haven't got the ships to lay the cables, then you're in trouble. If you haven't got the cables to put there, it's all very well having the financing in place, but if you haven't got the raw materials and the actual bits and pieces you need to do it, then you're going to be having a bottleneck.
And finance doesn't come to the table unless it actually knows that those projects can be built and it has the confidence that they can be built in the time that there is obviously the delivery for the project. And so, in much of these cases, and this is why industrial manufacturing policy is such a big part of the equation, because in many of these cases, the time and the lead time to actually build out these cables take years to develop, and you have to kind of book the slots to actually get the manufacturing slots in advance. So all these things are really interconnected.
And which is why it comes back fundamentally to getting the policy right, which of course is at the top, is part of your background. You worked in government and were a senior advisor to Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop until 2018. What did that role involve, and what did you learn from that environment of policy setting and driving policy?
Judgment is key. Well, I think it taught me a lot about how nations work together, and negotiation and good outcomes are possible with persistence.
Yeah.
And that you can design anything. You can design policy to have the right outcomes, or you can design really bad policy that will lead to really bad outcomes. And so getting that right first time is really key. But I think that governments do this too late. Like, I think that actually the slowness here is that they're catching up. Governments are catching up. And I don't think that this is necessarily kind of a fault. It's a little bit of a system issue, because there needs to be some form of ability to respond to the market. How do you create policy from no need? But we've got to get that timing better. That's a key thing that will help with the energy transition, that helps with energy security, is actually kind of how do you design policy in almost kind of earlier terms, and do so that's flexible and nimble enough. Because
that gives the private sector, the supply chain, the confidence to invest. It gives people a knowledge of what the pipeline of their future ambition is going to be.
Exactly. Yeah.
That work led you to meet Atlassian co-founder Mike, as you mentioned, Mike Cannon-Brookes, who was becoming one of Australia's most vocal and aggressive climate investors. What was it about his approach that was different from what you'd seen previously, perhaps when you were working in government?
I think conviction. Mike had conviction. He was really interested in saying, I've got the means, I've got the capacity, and I will invest heavily. But conviction and vision. I mean, I still credit Mike with so much of being able to actually raise the bar for what Australia can do. And he sees that, and he goes after it.
Yeah.
And I think, that is, you need these leaders. You need these leaders that actually will act with conviction to back others and to back the industry and to see the opportunity.
Yeah. And of course that led you to renewable energy project Sun Cable, which of course he was backing. You described that as not a normal renewable project. Why did you say that? Describe the sheer scale and the word audacity, perhaps, of what Sun Cable was set out to do.
Well, I mean, Australia is, as we know, a very large country with a lot of sun. And so we actually have enough solar energy to power the world's economy 100 times over. Like, this is an enormous resource. And David Griffin, founder and kind of visionary of Sun Cable, saw this and thought, well, why can't we actually export that directly, or indeed actually build out the opportunity in Australia and then use that power to create other things, green ammonia, etc., and even just build out huge, large-scale, industrial-sized opportunities in Australia.
Take advantage of that. You've got lots of land, lots of sun, and therefore lots of opportunity.
Exactly, and also a stable economy, a stable government. Lots of good things to see in terms of investing in Australia's renewable energy capacity. And so this presents an enormous challenge and an opportunity. How do you actually make the most of that and build that out as quickly as possible? And so this, I think what captured my imagination, if you will, is how can you actually completely look at transforming both Australia's energy capacity, but also Australians often look to our, above us, to our north, Southeast Asia. We've got, Indonesia, which is only a 3 or 4 hour flight away from Australia. And these economies are huge opportunities, and huge need for power and generation, and that can't all be they can't access all of that power from internally. They actually need to import power, and so Australia, obviously, with its proximity, provides a really, really big opportunity for that.
All this opportunity. You spent 3 years with Sun Cable as Chief Corporate and Government Affairs Officer. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in early 2023, Sun Cable went into voluntary administration. So what happened then? And what did that whole process teach you about delivering this kind of, I suppose, first of a kind technology?
Here's the thing. I think that when you're building a business that's a pathfinder business that's never done anything like this before, then what is actually happening is you're actually building the enabling environment. It's like kind of like this period of time. And this is what I realized on reflection when I'm working in Singapore, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. And actually, many of these projects are now taking place, direct cable transfer of electricity, and the power that's needed to be traded between those countries. These things seem possible now. And I think building that enabling environment, which means actually demonstrating the technology exists, the capacity is there, these help to meet the net zero needs. And so I think what happened with Sun Cable is it was visionary. There was a lot that needed to happen, a lot in advance, and things take time.
So it was ahead of its time, ahead of the regulatory process, ahead of the competitive environment, was it?
Well, it certainly was setting the table for others to join, and there's a lot of good things that have happened there. But yes, the time that it takes, and this is again a really deep pressure with the energy transition in general, is it's really important to do, for example, environmental impact studies. They take 2 to 3 years to do those really well. So if you're needing to do all of those things all at once across the project, so everything from environment, project financing, ensuring that you can actually access the kit that you need to build the project and do all of these things at once, that's going to take time. And I think this is exactly what Sun Cable and other visionary kind of companies discover along the way, which is, do we stay the course with our strategy here, and do we continue this? And that's really just ultimately, I think, going to be a bump in the road in Sun Cable's journey. But I think that we can take lessons and learnings from that, which is like, how do you share knowledge and transfer what companies are doing in this kind of energy transition, and use that for good in other places?
Presumably it's also how can governments support businesses like that through those difficult times?
100%. I mean, I think being able to see the capability and vision and say, these technologies are available. How do we back those? I don't think that it requires kind of government handouts. I think this comes down to governments having a strategy as well about what
policy thing.
What do they harness? What are the strategic advantages of any nation? What does, and I think, Indonesia's even done this to say, well, we've got a lot of the world's nickel. We actually want to do a lot of the processing in Indonesia to capture the value. That's actually a smart strategy. So how can Australia, or how can others actually harness their capability? And how do you match that with then companies that are actually going after that?
So having done all of this in Australia and looked to the north, you then set off to the north and moved to Boston in the US as a Fulbright scholar, and then to MIT Sloan School of Management as a research fellow. Why? What drove that? What drove you away from Australia and the sunshine to Boston?
3 things. I very much realized I like working with engineers.
Right.
And so MIT felt like a really natural hub for that. 2, I realized that actually you have to see the system. And we'd been working in that for so long. And so I wanted to go and study systems thinking, systems dynamics, and really kind of understand how to then apply that. And I think the third thing is the US and markets like the US, like the UK, are really fundamental to be able to access and mobilize the capital. And I wanted to have the opportunity to work in these markets to kind of bring this knowledge and learning back to the Indo-Pacific region. And
you've now moved to New York. And I suppose if you can make it there, as they say. Why New York?
I'm wearing a blue dress today in support of the Knicks won.
Oh, right. You really have become New York. Yeah.
New York's an amazing global hub for thinking, for finance, for actually the vision of being able to do these things. So it's a wonderful spot. I think it makes sense at the moment because we're seeking to influence deeply different parts of the system, and one of those is the financial community, and being able to work with really visionary American and other leaders in this space. And I think the new frontier of what what needs to kind of happen and to be able to mobilize capital is about working together. And this is a great market to have a foothold.
Interesting that, because you could argue that the US renewable market right now is something of a difficult place to be. That's not the case then?
I don't feel that. No, I think that there's a pragmatism that I have. I mean, after working in foreign policy and politics for quite some time, the world has shifts and usually they come in 3 to 4 years, political cycles. And we have to transcend those cycles and we have to actually see through that. And so New York's and the US is still seeking to play a significant role. The financial leaders there and the industry leaders are really kind of looking at markets, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific region and other locations, to say, well, how do we share and transfer innovation, knowledge, capital for the benefit of all? And that's, this is a really key place to do it. And as is the UK. Yeah.
Well, I have to ask, I suppose, how does an Australian get on with living in New York? What do you get up to when you're not busy doing deals and trying to make renewable energy work?
I've had to really try and understand the MBA clearly, so that's the key. No,
you ditched Australian rules football. And
never.
Never.
No. Swannies will always be my team.
Okay, fine.
But I think, just enjoying and making the most of a global international city. Amazing food, amazing places to explore, and trying to connect in with Australia and family and friends and everything as well.
Yeah. No, well, let's get back to the Australian and Southeast Asian investment market. As I mentioned in the intro, according to a recent report by the Australian government, Southeast Asia faces this $3 trillion infrastructure gap. Yet Australian investment in the region remains just 3.4% of its total. Why is Australia historically hesitant to get involved and invest in the Southeast Asian market?
Yeah, this is something I really took some time to understand while I was actually at MIT. And, I think at the same time that similar times, the Australian government put out a report that actually said Australia invested more at the time in New Zealand than it did in all of Southeast Asia.
Oh, right.
And, aggregate terms, Southeast Asia is the 4th largest economy in the world and has, also a significant population. So it's kind of bizarre given how close we are, but in a way it's not as well, because of course there is different risk profiles, and I think Australia has $3 trillion sitting in our kind of pension funds, and that's a lot of money that typically goes to find very de-risked or sort of steady investment opportunities, because ultimately this is mums and dads' money that needs to be spent well and invested well. And so that obviously is a factor in where and how we operate. But I think that these things are shifting and changing. And I think that there is, this ultimately comes down to people and connection and being able to translate the opportunities between each other.
Yeah, I'm also quite interested because it's a global, certainly a global business. We're here in London, chatting in the Institution of Civil Engineers. In fact, it's London Climate Action Week, and that brings together, of course, UK's financial and professional services ecosystem. Of course, the UK has its own, I touched upon them earlier, we have our own grid bottlenecks, connection queues, planning delays, supply chain constraints. Are they similar structural problems to the ones you've seen in Southeast Asia and Australia?
I think there are definitely principles that can be applied, and we need to learn from each other on those. I think, interestingly, the term NIMBYism comes up a lot here in the UK. Not in my backyard. Will I build, can I build that manufacturing facility? Where do I build it? Or are the poles and wires going to look kind of ugly in my neighborhood? And this is actually this issue of and it's a really fair and reasonable concern of communities to have, which is, how does this affect me? But I think that's a really core thing that happens no matter where you go in the world in terms of building out the energy transition and what that looks like.
It's good for people to have a view on these things.
Completely.
Because that's about community consultation. It's about getting communities behind projects.
Yes, exactly. And it also involves actually engaging with community on what is the solution here? How do we price and decrease the price of electricity? And that's, prices of energy prices are skyrocketing all around the world, not to mention obviously what's happening in the context of Iran. And so like these issues are really important to bring the community along and to consult and to find these kind of solutions together. But that's obviously not easy.
Well, you're running a session this week looking at some of these big challenges. What are you going to be talking about?
So we're really looking forward to tackling this issue of how to get institutional investors, so those that tend to have lower tolerance for risk, to the table to actually finance. Because when you really look at it, we need so many trillions of dollars to actually fund the energy transition. Yeah. And that's not just going to come from venture capital funding great technologies, but it's also going to take getting the larger pots of money to the table as well. And so how can we work together on that and build out blended finance platforms and opportunities in those areas to make sure that we can tackle this? So this is the kind of nuts and bolts of it. And because Australia has such a significant amount of this institutional capital, as does places like the UK, and there's some reforms happening here in the context of UK's pension funds and what they can invest in and others, we need to learn from others. Canada's been really good at this. They've historically invested a lot in Southeast Asia.
With their teaching unions, etc., and those sort of pension funds. Yeah.
Yes.
So looking forward, what has to happen next to accelerate that global energy transition? I mean, what's your immediate call to action, for governments perhaps, or for the marketers, to try to make sure that capital can move at pace and get those deals going?
I think what I'm seeing a lot of now, which is fantastic, is firms that are actually acting with the conviction. We've seen, for example, FastP, Singapore government work with others like HSBC, with BlackRock, to actually kind of establish funds that can fund this. And action is great. And now the conviction to work on those, work on mobilizing that capital requires essentially patience and due diligence. And I think acting, but at haste and sticking to timelines is going to be really key.
You mentioned also about cultural shift needed and a different mindset, a different approach for people to take. Well, what do you mean by that? How do you see that culture mindset shift?
Being able to see what the perceived risk is versus the actual risk, I think, is a really key issue. And this kind of happens a lot in emerging and developing economies where the risk profile is high. So being able to actually break that down and understand what exactly is the risk factor here, and then how can we look at adjusting the actions around supporting a change in that. So if that risk, for example, is that there is a policy or a regulatory environment that is not creating certainty, or if there is geopolitical tensions, then how can we actually work together and in a really particular way to address those issues?
Yeah. So it's finally, you've been inside the most ambitious clean energy project ever attempted. We talked about Sun Cable. You're now building the institutional frameworks that future projects will depend on. This is a long-term energy transition. What do you hope to have achieved, say, in the next 10 years in terms of really driving forward energy transition globally?
Looking at how we can rewire the energy transition, like the financial energy transition, and having those two things meet, using finance as the driver. As we say ad nauseum, the finance is there, which is true. So how do we actually mobilize that at a faster rate? Like there's a really great example of this, something that the Asian Development Bank was working on, a monsoon project, around 600 megawatts of power in Laos. And it was a fantastically well-structured project in terms of the financing. It just took a long time to do that. And understandably, because this is kind of pioneering to structure and a blended finance project. But we need to do that at scale and on repeat. And so if we can be playing a role in between the finance community and the project and project developers and build out that kind of like platform in between, I think this is going to be really key to see that the scale and pace of change happens.
Yeah. I mean, Georgie, it's exciting and it's difficult What gives you the confidence that we're going to succeed?
Because ultimately, we have an enormous opportunity to benefit from what the world creates and has. And I think, humans are at the center of all of this, and humans do a fantastic job of building out and working together when we really set our minds to it. And so why not now?
Yeah. Well, look, Georgie, it's really complex, really interconnected challenges that you're talking about there. Certainly something which is facing the infrastructure investment market, but also when you look around here in the institution of civil engineers, there's some really big engineering issues that need to be solved. But fundamentally, as you say, it's a systemic challenge that we face here. Brilliant to hear about the work you're doing, and thanks for sharing it today, and thanks for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's been a pleasure. Really fun.
Great stuff. Look, sadly, that's all we've got time for on the podcast now, but there is more in the pipeline as we continue to probe the big issues facing the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Georgie, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.